In the 1990s, hundreds of significant events occurred, but seeing as I only have a short time to talk about this historic decade, I've narrowed down some specific events and people I feel have most shaped America and my generation. Now, one of the earliest events to happen in the decade was arguably the most significant. In 1990 and 1991, the World Wide Web was having its first test trials run, and then it was fully publicized. Today in my life, I can hardly keep together if I don't have access to internet. Not just for my personal life, but for school as well. But possibly just as influential as the wealth of information internet provides, there is also social media. Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, and many other platforms have shaped the world I live in. On a more negative note, one verdict shook the nation in 1992. The Rodney King verdict caused an explosion of riots in LA after decades of our nation avoiding race issues. Regardless of what the verdict was, Americans had already made up their minds about the case. Before the police officers were ruled not guilty, a video of an African American man named Rodney King being brutally beaten by a police officer was released on national television. Continuing the trend of negative events, the 90s taught Americans to fear terrorism more than ever before. The terrorist attacks against Americans in the 90s seemed to come at random. Possibly the two most notable being the World Trade Center bombing in February 1993 and the Oklahoma City bombing in April 1995. Sadly, it seems these brutal attacks have not slowed moving forward into the 21st century. Moving on, elected in 1992 was Bill Clinton. Originally a governor from Arkansas, many say he embodied the modern American politician. But whether or not he reflects today's politics undoubtedly reflect the policies Clinton introduced in the United States. Now, Bill Clinton was a controversial character. Not everyone was his biggest fan. However, Newt Gingrich was even more controversial due to his ethics violations, which resulted in his resignation in 1999. But in 1995, Gingrich became Time magazine's Man of the Year for his work in enacting welfare reform and helping to create a more balanced federal budget for the first time since the late 1960s. Americans haven't always been the best at speaking up for what they need, but there's no doubt that American people found their voice for change more than ever in the 90s. This is demonstrated in the nationwide reaction to the O.J. Simpson case. O.J. Simpson was being implicated in the killing of his ex-wife, a white woman, as well as her possible lover. The trial dragged on issues of bloody gloves and DNA, shaped televised courtroom proceedings for years, but the emotional issues surrounding the couple's abusive interracial relationship caused different races and sexes to take different sides. Nonetheless, the event marked another time in the 90s when the American people were challenged to think deeply about race and privilege. Another topic which sparked deep thought in the U.S. citizens was music culture. Rap music and hip-hop created debates over race and class once again. The rap music scene had built up to a crescendo by the end of the 80s, and in the 90s it blew up, causing not only inner-city youths to have rap playing on their Walkmans, but suburban youths as well. These new genres created classic sounds that not only defined music, but an entire generation and the issues surrounding them. As influential as the pastime as music was, the reality TV craze also dominated America throughout the 90s, has continued into the 21st century. A pioneer of this craze was a little show on MTV called The Real World, which aired in 1992. By focusing on a group of young people living together in an apartment in New York City and talking about topics such as sexuality, substance abuse, abortion, and other issues, The Real World came to define not only what was important to American citizens, but also how they talked about it, and later, how my generation would as well. While we're on the topic of television, shows like Seinfeld and Friends were busy redefining social norms in the 90s. Seinfeld was a show about nothing, and centered around four single friends' ridiculous misadventures involving dating, work, and the city, while Friends provided something even younger and edgier, with 6 young adults all dealing with love and social lives in New York City as well. Both shows featured unmarried characters well past an age previous generations might have considered normal, shaping our views of modern relationships. Surprisingly enough, however, the biggest change from television came through cartoons such as The Simpsons and South Park. The Simpsons defined the modern primetime cartoon of the 90s and allowed other cartoons to be created in the same form. dusting off old cartoons, and combining new characters that everyday people could relate to with crude humor that never would have been accepted if it were not portrayed through a silly cartoon. This led to new cartoons for the modern era. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this quick trip through some of the most influential parts of the 1990s.